6-point night as the Sixers beat the Raptors in overtime, 104-101, and they grab a commanding 3-0 lead in that best-of-7. All right, joined by Bill Reiter. And Bill, we were talking about this watching the game. This is why teams that have stars win in the postseason versus teams that don't. The Sixers have a star. They put it in his hands, and he took them home.
What a sick and unbelievable way for Philly fans to celebrate and for Raptors fans to have their hearts broken and their season nearly eliminated. You said it. Joel Embiid is one of the 3 guys who are in competition to win the MVP this year. Whether he gets it or he doesn't, he showed why he is one of the most valuable players on the face of the earth. What a cold-blooded shot at the end of that game.
Nick Nurse is a terrific coach, but off the inbounds, they're 0.9 on the shot clock. Not much the Sixers can do. Do you need to kind of have a body or two on Embiid right on the sideline?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of those things where they made him turn to his right. He had to turn basically to his left. He's not in momentum with his shooting hand. It's an unbelievable shot. And you don't want to leave Tyrese Maxey open. I mean, I'm not sure I'm a big believer in Tobias Harris, but he can hit shots. There's other guys on the floor. They forced Embiid into what is a really difficult shot 9 out of 10 times, maybe 19 out of 20 times. Most guys don't even come close. But he's a superstar, as you said, and he hits it.
33 points, 13 rebounds in a game in which James Harden fouled out of this game prior to overtime. Harden had 19. Maxey, as you mentioned, had 19 for Philadelphia. They're up 3-0. When you look at this Raptors team, Precious Achiuwa had a nice game, 20 points, but missed 2 clutch free throws in this game in the final seconds of regulation. In overtime, OG Anunoby, also a player that had a strong game, 26 points, missed 1 of 2 late. How debilitating is that when your team has a shot in these games to grab one and it slips through their fingers?
You nailed it. This is heartbreaking beyond just the fact that you lost and now you're in a huge hole in this series. They hold Joel Embiid to a paltry number of points in the first half.
5.
They keep Tobias Harris, Tyrese Maxey, and James Harden limited to a pedestrian offensive evening for each of those guys. They weren't bad, but they weren't extraordinary. Toronto turned over this Philly team more than 20 times. And you controlled the game for big chunks, and you're right, had multiple opportunities to make free throws, to try and, if not seal the game, at least control the momentum and at the end win it. It is the most brutal way you can lose, and it's a reminder, superstars win games.
That's true.
And young teams without superstars, that pressure has to shift to someone. It's easy to say you got to make those shots. It's hard to do in the moment, and I like this Toronto team, and we discussed how good of a coach Nick Nurse is. There is not a superstar on this team. There just isn't. And
true.
A lot of contributors from a lot of players. Gary Trent Jr. looked like he was more informed in the last game, put up a lot of points. But at the end of the competition, when Embiid was doing Embiid things, there was no one Toronto could turn to and say, win the game for.
Absolutely. We were talking about during the course of the game, the Raptors went through a stretch where they missed 10 straight threes. They were just clamoring for a basket there. And if you want to say Pascal Siakam's their guy, he had 12 points in this game. Fred VanVleet, 3 of 13 from the floor. He had a dozen points. So give the Sixers some credit on the defensive end from that standpoint as well. But when you look at how this team started the game, went into the break up 10, had all the momentum, the crowd behind them, how does that carry over this finish now into Game 4?
Look, I think you never say never. And I don't believe in must-win games until it's a must-win game. Obviously, it will be. But this is as close as it comes to a must-win game that you didn't win when you're not actually technically eliminated. Because now, and look, Doc Rivers teams in the past have had some difficulty holding on to sizable leads. 3-1, 3-2. This is a 3-0 series lead. They have Joel Embiid. And you mentioned this. Defensively, Embiid was a huge part of what they did well down the stretch. Siakam looked utterly flabbergasted and flummoxed as he tried to attack the rim. Embiid was there every time. And you saw moments where guys would play downhill, get to the rim. Embiid's there. He's a defensive force. They're throwing the ball out. They're turning it over. With that guy on your team, with this sizable of a lead, with Maxey having emerged as a really, really reliable, not overwhelming all the time, but reliable offensive weapon, it's really hard to see a scenario where the Raptors are playing basketball in a week.
Yeah, and we talked about Nick Nurse, and quite frankly, Bill, Nurse had some issues with the officiating in the early games of this series, thinking about them, calls that weren't made against Joel Embiid. Sixers had an overwhelming free throw advantage, but when you watch this game, you saw some missed calls really on both sides. Quite frankly, as we've mentioned over and over again, big-name players are going to get calls in these big games.
Yeah, that's the way that it goes. And I'm a child of, we talked about this, I'm a child of Michael Jordan. That's the era I grew up in, Chicago suburbs. Love Mike. MJ got a lot of calls because he was Michael Jordan. In this game, I think Nick Nurse's complaining, frustration, the venting earlier in the series led to some help. And there was a play at the end of the game where Embiid was called for a pretty big foul that led to those missed free throws we're talking about that really didn't look like a foul. So in this case, I think the Raptors got a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt. You saw Doc Rivers get really frustrated with some of the officiating. It came down to the fact that the Sixers had a guy in Embiid who could overcome whatever those frustrations were, and the Raptors didn't.
Yeah, there was one on Harden in which Harden fouled out as well. You touched on this. The Joel Embiid impact on games from a defensive standpoint is so vital as well. We know what he can do offensively, but you see time and time again, as you mentioned, players coming through the lane and veering away from him or kicking it out because of his presence in the middle. This
is the thing that Giannis Antetokounmpo does. Obviously good enough. We've seen him take a team to an NBA championship. LeBron James, when he was a little bit younger, he might take exception with that a little bit. LeBron, you're a little bit older. Are those two-way players who are top 5 players in the league who are remarkably impactful on the defensive end too. It's just that kind of impact is huge. Embiid does it. He has it. We saw what he did offensively. We know the shots that he can hit, but he's a defensive force. And when that Philly defense, which isn't great, frankly, breaks down or isn't really doing what he needs to do, it feels like Embiid's always there making the difference on whatever end of the floor he's on.
Bill, one more for you. In a sense that, we can see if we look into our crystal balls, this kind of moving towards a Philly-Miami matchup. Have you seen anything from this Sixers team that not only with regards to that potential series, but moving forward into the Eastern Conference Finals that maybe has changed your mindset about Philadelphia?
It's a great question. I honestly, I'm not sure because early in this game as Toronto was able, and it wasn't a sizable lead, but they maintained a 2 or 3 possession lead for big chunks of the game. I just thought to myself, this Philly team doesn't have that killer instinct. They're not putting this team down. They're injured. They're banged up, right? They're missing some guys. But then Joel Embiid went to that next level and got it done. I think for the first time probably in this NBA season, certainly since the Harden trade, yes, I'm starting to view Philly as a legitimate title contender. But I need to see the proof against, with all respect to the Raptors, a top-level team. That isn't Toronto. That is Miami. But I'm starting to be a believer. Now, there's 5 or 6 teams that I think come out of the East.
Absolutely.
But I'm starting to be a believer.
Yeah, and Joel Embiid is the huge reason why. He's Bill Reiter on the heels of a Sixers, pretty much a buzzer beater. Joel Embiid with .7 on the clock, taking out the Raptors and giving Philadelphia a 3-0 advantage.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.